ladies and gentlemen, to the news. Today, 10 years ago, there were published pictures of a huge scandal of the US troops in Iraq. Everything started with the terrorist attacks on the 11th of September 2001. The USA began to discuss if torture should become allowed. Already one year later, Donald Rumsfeld introduced to scare surveyed people in Guantanamo with dogs or ordered them to stand naked in uncomfortable poses for hours. After the war in Iraq, the US troops used Abu Ghraib as a military base and prison. Till October 2003, there were more than 6,000 prisoners, and 90% of these people were guiltless but were tortured like any others too. 2004, 10 years ago, many pictures of tortures in Abu Ghraib were broadcasted in the TV and newspapers. Besides the degrading poses, there was also reported about rapes and many dead persons, but it was portrayed as an accident and not as murder by torture. Now here's Dr. Zimbardo, and he will tell us something about the theory.
Hi, my name is Dr. Philip Zimbardo. I wrote the books The Lucifer Effect and The Essentials of Psychology and Life. I wrote the theory Lucifer Effect after the Stanford prison experiment, and I called it The Lucifer Effect after the story of the angel Lucifer, who was subordinated from heaven into hell, which I think represents how good can become evil. So how do people understand the transition of character? Well, to start, there is disposition or transition, which is inside of individuals. So a few bad apples as such, in a bunch. And then there's situational, which is the external factors, such as the bad barrel the apples are held in. And finally, there's the systemic transition, which is the bad barrel makers that create the bad barrels. These are broad influences such as political, economic and legal power.
So how does this explain why the soldiers did what they did?
Well, the Lucifer Effect has a large influence on the happenings at Abu Ghraib. To start, the disposition, so the bad apples, would only account for a small number of the soldiers in the vast number that were there, because the vast majority couldn't all have been sadistic, so we've got to cancel that out. This was, however, the reason that was given up by the higher-ranking officials by saying this is the work of a few bad individuals.
So, is it down to the situational and the systemic?
Well, they're not the only factors that can solve why this happens. They definitely do have a large role in helping to explain. The fact that the soldiers were sent into a prison with 300 soldiers guarding over 3,000 prisoners is a pretty bad situation. This could have an effect on the mentality of some of the soldiers, as they were having to guard men that were branded as American killers and members of Al-Qaeda. This would make the American soldiers behave in a much less humane manner in the company of these individuals, so the bad barrel. But let's not forget the systemic, the bad barrel makers. The soldiers were given instruction to do what they did. This is a picture of a man standing on the box, which is a specific torture technique devised in Brazil. How are American soldiers going to know about such a specific technique and how to execute it without instruction from somewhere above? So this makes us wonder, what is happening up the chain of command? As Al-Qaeda didn't sign the Geneva Convention and were not following the rules of warfare, American lawyers were asked to manipulate the Geneva Convention itself to its very simplest form and would allow soldiers to do certain torture. So they thought that they were following the Geneva Convention as they were sent details about stress positions from those above.
And now welcome Mr. Tyler.
My theory is a social identity theory. This is how people see themselves in relation to the membership of their social groups.
Could you explain further?
Social categorisation is the first stage, where one sees himself as part of an in-group, from categorising oneself as part of the in-group to identify with the groups more overtly. In the social identification stage, an individual is likely to take the norms of a group. The third and final stage is a social comparison stage. This is where an individual compares the in-group that he or she belongs to the out-group. People see the in-group as better, which enhances their self-esteem.
And how does this relate to Abu Ghraib?
I believe it started when the Twin Towers were bombed and they saw themselves as groups against terrorists. The soldiers then went through social identification when they arrived in Iraq by overtly identifying themselves as the in-group. They did this by wearing the US Army uniform. They then would take on group norms and behaviour of those around them. The soldiers then proceed to social comparison when they started guarding the prison. They saw the prisoners as lower, so they had the out-group hostility towards them and felt as the in-group was better. The comparison was not confined to just thoughts, but the discriminating acts involved physical, sexual and severe mental abuse towards the prisoners.
Now we welcome Dr. Milgram.
Hi Jasmine, my name is Stanley Milgram and I devised the agency theory in 1968.
So tell me about yourself.
8 years after getting my PhD in social psychology at Harvard, I delved further into my curiosity of the Holocaust. I wondered if the Nazis were in a different state of mind which allowed them to do such things. And my findings indicate that they were. In my 1968 experiment, I found that an individual can undergo an agentic shift. This is when they shift from an autonomous state, whereby the individual is fully responsible of their own actions and has free will, to an agentic state, where the individual is obeying an authoritative figure and has given up all free will and responsibility to this authority figure.
So how does your theory apply to Abu Ghraib?
My theory can be used to explain the Abu Ghraib happenings. The soldiers are trained to be agents of authority and believe they have a duty to protect America. They would be agents obeying the orders, giving up their free will and handing responsibility to these authoritative figures, rather than autonomous individuals who make their own decisions. The soldiers would not have been in an autonomous state and would have therefore been more able to carry out the orders given to them by the authority figure. In my opinion, the blame must be put on the authority figures. These were the high-ranking officers. I can fully justify this opinion by using the results from my experiment in 1968. Normal people selected from the newspaper took part in my experiment, where they had to administer shocks which they believed to be real on the Confederate learner. Results showed that 66% of the sample administered the full 450-volt shock and 100% administered the 300-volt shock, which was labelled severe danger. If normal male individuals obeyed a person in a lab coat who prodded them to proceed in giving shocks, what could a uniformed soldier do when obeying a more senior rank?
Moving to our next guest today, I'm very proud to say that Bertram Raven is here in the studio with us today. Bertram worked with John French back in the 1960s and devised a very influential theory of power which is still used today. So Bertram, welcome and it's great to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
So would you just mind to give our audience a quick background of yourself?
Of course, that's fine. I'm an American academic, been a member of the faculty of the psychology department at UCLA for around 58 years now. Obviously, as you said, I'm mostly known for my work with John French. Together we developed an analysis of the 5 bases, or as you say, 5 forms of social power.
Well, no one can doubt your influence and contribution to describing and analyzing different types of social power. But after the recent outbreak of the story from Abu Ghraib, which has shocked the entire world, do you think your theory can be applied to the situation that the American soldiers were in at Abu Ghraib?
I definitely think that the 5 forms of social power can apply to this situation. Abu Ghraib was obviously a horrific event. We devised the theory based on that it can be applied to most situations such as this one. So this is no different to that at all.
Please could you then briefly describe how your theory applies to the situation in terms of the 5 forms of power?
Okay, for me, all 5 forms come into play. Obviously, some are more prominent than the others, but they all play that part. The form of power that began the horrific events, for me, was legitimate power. Now, legitimate power is simply legal power, for those that don't know. It comes from a higher role, so in this case, we're still unsure where it stemmed from. First ideas point the finger, President Bush, understandable, obviously he does have legitimate power, and if he wanted this to happen, he could have easily done it without actually getting his hands dirty, so to speak. He used soldiers, such as Sergeant Brown, who we've heard about, General Miller we've also heard about, to carry out the work for him. Now, of course, we can't jump to conclusions right now to say that he was definitely 100% the one who made it all happen, but the orders definitely came from a higher source, from a higher person, and these army reservists had to carry out their orders, as that's what they're told to do, being army reservists.
So what about the other forms?
All the other forms, as I say, come into play. Expert power comes from people who have extra knowledge, experts in their field. Obviously this is also very prominent, the way the actual soldiers, as I mentioned, Sergeant Ghraib, were very experienced in their field. They knew what they were doing, great knowledge. Army reservists lacked that. They were only reservists, they didn't quite know what they were doing. The real soldiers had been sent out to Ghraib and would have had great expert power. They would have known exactly what they were doing, and they could tell the reservists what to do whenever they wanted, and because they had the extra knowledge, the reservists would have done it. Other forms of power, referent power, the army reservists would have looked up to the sergeants and the other soldiers. They would have been role models for them. They would have been what they wanted to be in a few years' time. They would have been that much higher that they looked up to them and thought, that's what I want to be like. So they would have followed what they would have wanted to do. So not only did these sergeants and other soldiers have referent power, they also had expert power, and we want to coercive power. Now, coercive power comes from people that force other people to do something against their own will. So we look at moral strain. I mean, you had Milgram on the show before about his agency theory, and it's evident the army reservists towards the end didn't quite, the actual soldiers didn't quite have full coercive power over them, but the ones that came forward with the information images obviously suffered from this moral strain. They didn't follow what they were doing was correct, which obviously it wasn't, but that's what they had to do at the end of the day, and these so-called real soldiers still did have coercive power until right to the end, and they still do to this day, but it was evident that it was lacked towards the end, and it was just a shame that all the soldiers didn't stand up for what they believed in. And then lastly, we obviously have reward power. Now, reward power, some will say, didn't really come into this because most of the soldiers were reservists. They didn't receive as much money, they didn't get as much praise, but it wasn't desirable for them. It wasn't in their job description. But we've recently heard that during the events in Abu Ghraib, a letter was sent from a senior official. We do not yet know which senior official it was, but senior officer to some army reservists saying that they were doing a great job to continue their work, they were serving the country well, and for that, to an army reservist, is a great feat. As I've been on the army reservists to receive this letter from a higher official, they're obviously going to be very pleased and they're going to continue that.
That has given our audience a great insight to the 5 forms of power and how it relates to our Ghraib. And from everyone here, we can't thank you enough for coming on today, and we will wish you all the best for your future.
It's always a pleasure.